Shanghai, 2025. Typical evening on the east side of the Huangpu River. Crowds queue up along river parapets to see the city's nightly ritual. In a synchronous go, floodlights kick up an exposure of illumination across the river's wall of architectural mass, the front line of which, key-lit in warm hues, reserved for the 27 historical structures that make up Shanghai's Bund. Taken in full, the spot has outlived the collapse of an empire, 7 wars, 2 revolutions, and 7 different ruling states. Now, after all that 19th and 20th century turmoil, the Bund is diligently preserved by the People's Republic of China, restored and protected for citizens and tourists to appreciate how much China has changed. It's something special, seeing the architectural and engineering achievements of the modern skyline against the Bund's classical works. And in the spirit of such appreciation, I invite you to join me as we travel to 1936 and construct the Bund as it appeared then on the eve of the Second Sino-Japanese War, height of the Shanghai concession period, middle of the American Great Depression, and when Art Deco Mania was such an explosive vision of the future that the thought of these once cutting-edge skyscrapers blasting off as rocket ships wasn't such a cracked-up fantasy. So, from a collection of tools, Unreal 5 as the vehicle for this survey, the clock shall first be rewound to 19th century Imperial China. 1839 had the Daoguang Emperor, supreme ruler of the Qing Dynasty and therefore China at the time, getting caught up in a disagreement with the British Empire. Chinese trade with Europeans was limited to the ports of Guangzhou, then referred to as Canton. And the East India Trading Company, on behalf of the British Empire, had been importing the addictive and soul-sucking drug of opium into the port, an overwhelmingly lucrative cash crop straight from British-controlled India. From the ports of Canton, the drug spread like a disease across China. Unlike today, it should be no surprise that the pain relief and euphorium of opium leads to an addiction that, for many, has no escape sans death. So detrimental was the drug that across Imperial China, the spread of smoking opium could be tracked by communities of smokers. Especially heavy doses made the users zombie-like in nature, minds eroded by a dependency on the poppy. So, it could be considered rather reasonable that in 1839 the emperor banned the trade completely and seized British opium shipments outside the ports of Canton. Reasonable, of course, except for opium traders like Jardine and Matheson, or their royal benefactor back home, feeling first a wound and pride over seizure of goods, though nothing a good diplomatic run couldn't solve. But the following realization that this is the end of an infinite and easy profit machine was enough to start a war, and the British Empire does so. The British start a series of campaigns up the Pearl River from Kowloon to Canton, numerous naval battles during a time where Britannia ruled the waves. By 42, the British had captured Shanghai and numerous other cities, closing in at Nanjing, then called Nanking. The British forced the Qing emperor into a considerably one-sided treaty, where not only was the continuation of the opium trade in China secured, but spoils included the colonization of Hong Kong in addition to what begins our story. Shanghai, by treaty, was unscrupulously opened up and forced to play permanent host to a British concession. Along the Huangpu River, then called the Huangpu River, Shanghai was rather small compared to its current size, with most of the land outside the Chinese city being a disease-ridden swamp. The British took the unusable land north of the city and began construction of a European settlement. Streets were laid out by modern grid standards, wondrous architecture constructed too, and it wasn't long before utility developments brought gas, electric, and telegraph services to China for the first time. Trade out of Shanghai became dominant in China. From the Pacific, foreign ships had easy access to Shanghai off the Huangpu River, while inland junks and streamers brought Chinese goods into the city for shipments westbound. A rather successful deal for Chinese and foreign merchants alike. But the treaty gave the Brits a bit of an advantage. The British Empire had enforced a policy of extraterritoriality, meaning that British citizens could not be prosecuted for crimes they committed in Shanghai, Any offenses would have to be tried in British courts, which you can imagine really meant that basically crimes were rarely tried, and foreigners could therefore run wild, taking care, of course, not to offend the British settlement authorities. And not to be outdone in such an absurd arrangement, the Americans and French felt they had to get in on the action as well, forcing the weakened Qing emperor to give them similar arrangements in Shanghai. The Americans established a settlement north of the British above Suqiao Creek, and the French formed their own concession south of the British below Yangjing Creek. Later on in the 1860s, the American and British combined their settlements into a larger entity called the Shanghai International Settlement, which they agreed to rule together via a council called the SMC. However, the French stayed out and continued running their own operation independently. This system of concessions went on all the way until World War II, but really Shanghai didn't return to China in its entirety without the Americans parking their army there until 1949, when the People's Republic of China became the ultimate authority. Though that's still many years out, as our survey is interested in the 30s specifically. So let's take this map, Shanghai Xie Jietu, read right to left, and the old manner of traditional Chinese characters from the period. Characters that went out of style in mainland China during the 50s when the People's Republic simplified the language. This puts the map right in the money of what we want timeline-wise. And as expected, south is the French concession, central is the British settlement with a big horse racing track, typical, and below the concessions here, the original Chinese city. Then, following the Huangpu River north to its confluence with Suqiao Creek is the Bund, center of our expedition. I'm partway through modeling out the environment in Unreal 5, still a work in progress at the moment, and lest I commit the most unforgivable sin, models are a mix of my own in the foreground here, with many of the background buildings and vehicles being 3D scans and meshes I've picked up online. Such is the same for many of the props and artifacts which I generally purchased. Credits to the modelers from CG Trader and other sites will be posted at the end of the video. Though, for the purpose of the survey, the Jewel of the Bund, the Cathay Hotel, today called the Peace Hotel, centers the most important part of the scene. Certainly, in the 30s, this was one of the most busy corners in Shanghai, where the Bund meets Nanking Road, today called Nanjing Road. The city's big shopping corridor, then and still is now, basically the Fifth Ave of Shanghai. Naturally, I've modeled the Cathay with considerable rigor as the first phase of the project. My early surveys brought me much needed detail for the Art Deco tower. See the greyhounds cast into the metalwork of the arched windows, the Sassoon house title, shield reliefs cut into the stone blocks, articles of indication to the owner of the building, Sir Victor Sassoon, Shanghai real estate mogul and at the time probably the most powerful businessman in the city. Sir Victor, like many of the elite in the city, found that real estate prices soar when you've got a council of friends in the SMC that prevent any level of growth to the city, under the reasons of ease to defend, to be sure, but a rapidly growing population hub and a booming local economy locked into a tight space is a particularly good environment for real estate speculation. According to the book Last Kings of Shanghai, which explains much of the financial systems in the city at the time, real estate in 1935 was booming. Pulling money out of the American market and buying real estate here would yield gains 3 times asset value. A tempting venture given the depression in America, and foreigners took up the offer. Places like the Broadway mansions north of the Bund offered luxury lodgings for reasonable costs, a lifestyle comparable to the way that the wealthy elite lived in cities like New York or Paris. Hobbies typically for the wealthy were therefore quite accessible. You could be gambling at the Canadrone dog track or the horse track outside the old Park Hotel, right alongside the likes of Sir Victor and the city elite. Though good luck winning any dog racing bets against someone who'd ornamented their skyscraper with greyhound decor that survived almost a century. And if your speed is more cars, Hollywood movies, and modern consumer products, the city's port delivered. Ships arriving on the daily had set in a captivation with the latest trends and products, leading to this fusion of an east-west style. Take the traditional Qipao, tailored to a modern fit. Popular with the ladies who here didn't have to be a celebrity to step out onto the town nightly and show off the latest fads of fashion to an abundance of glass from newly imported consumer cameras. And this was another favorite of Victor Sassoon, photography. That of Shanghai's women, everyone knew his obsession there, but also the city. The Cathay featured a balcony attached to his private suite, so he could step out as if onto the bow of a ship and film the activity below. But in reality, from his perch at the Cathay, he was maestro to the city's infamous nightlife. Remember that bit about foreigners here getting off scot-free for all sorts of crimes? Well, turns out that makes a great environment for the most degenerate levels of morality a man may debase himself to. And in the 30s, with the rest of the world in economic depression, money still went far in Shanghai, given that East-West trade was still booming. John Powell, a Shanghai resident and reporter, described that despite the streets choked with opium smoke, crime, and corruption, Westerners who could get away with murder, you'd also paradoxically have Shanghailanders being among some of the most kind and generous people you'd have the pleasure to meet. A confusion that couldn't be better stated than Christian missionaries holding revivals out of gambling parlors loaned to them for free, at least during the day. By night, these Art Deco clubs hosted their e-ticket attraction, Sing Song Girls, whereupon, say, 10 cents a dance, their services only began. The background tune to which was the East's first exposure to exotic jazz out of Harlem. So, it's quite fitting that in the opening to the Temple of Doom, Willie Scott sings a rendition of Cole Porter's Anything Goes, so incoherent that the locals were probably confused as to if it's Cantonese, Mandarin, or Shanghainese dialect. Perfect background track to a neon-lit club full of gangsters sitting down for business with a world-famous archaeologist. Hopefully, things don't end up getting too rowdy in there.
Anything goes.
Of the anything goes mindset, Sir Victor Sassoon hosted events nightly at the Cathay Hotel. Themed costume parties were his favorites, and often attended by warlords, royalty, Hollywood celebrities. Really, anyone with just a bit of cash could have the adventure of a lifetime in the span of an evening. Old Victor himself built his real estate empire rather quickly, though from a rather dodgy origin. See, the Sassoon name goes further back. Before the First Opium War, the British shipping company, Jardine and Matheson, same one involved with the First Opium War, their office being this building on the Bund here, they had grown rather prosperous, largely by bringing opium from Calcutta to market in China, setting the stage for the Sassoon family to conduct a similar business. The Sassoons were a historically important Baghdadi Jewish family who'd moved their textile and fine cotton operations under the British colonial umbrella of Bombay, India, as a means of avoiding exploitative business dealings against Jews in Baghdad. Patriarch of the family, David Sassoon, saw an opportunity to move into the opium business around the 1840s by growing the crop in Bombay and exporting to China on his own ships. In other words, he was controlling every level of the production, unlike Jardine and Matheson, who were mostly transporting the drug only. Quite a shrewd business decision that made the Sassoons immensely wealthy and powerful within the British Empire as the largest controllers of the opium business, even lobbying the royal family to keep opium legal in China. But what really shot the Sassoons towards generational power was the Second Opium War. Ever since the First Opium War, the Qing Dynasty felt they sort of got the raw end of the stick as far as that treaty went. And even though opium was technically still illegal, they couldn't do much to stop the British from importing the drug. So, for a decade and a half, tensions ran hot until a spark set off a whole chain of nasty and probably avoidable conflicts. 1856, British diplomat Sir Harry S. Parkes claimed the Viceroy of Canton had seized a merchant ship in breach of maritime rule. The Viceroy, Ye Mingchen, denied the claims that maritime law was breached, insisting it was within their bounds to seize the ship as it was displaying signs of a pirate vessel. Sort of a difficult affair to sort out without as much hard evidence. And frankly, even British Parliament didn't trust their own man, Parkes, thinking he was, let's just say, not being particularly accurate in his recount of the events. But that didn't necessarily matter because tensions were already bad, and this was fuel on the fire. Then, to make matters worse, Parks continued to inflame the situation with China, inevitably leading to another war to break out again. But this time, the French hopped on board along with the Americans on the side of the British. The Russian Empire too, though they acted in some ways as more of an intermediary. And I should say too, the Americans rather quickly dipped out of the conflict, signing a peace agreement with China early on. A shame that the Americans couldn't have taken this lesson to heart. But nonetheless, after a year, the British take Canton and peace is attained. But not for long because the Qing emperor hadn't had enough and combat resumed with the capture and torture of the diplomat catalyst, Harry Parks, which in turn inflamed the British to sack and destroy the famous Qing Summer Palace out of revenge for Sir Parks' treatment, and of course, general bloodlust. Finally, when the war ends in 1860, the British forced the Qing emperor to legalize opium completely, handing the Sassoon family just about the greatest gift they could ask for. Now, they could sell the drug legally and even openly employ Chinese dealers in the process. The Sassoon family later split between David's line, known as the Old Sassoon in China, and a branched-off company started by his son Elias, whose Chinese venture was known as New Sassoon. Both companies under the Sassoon house had made, if adjusted to modern values, $2.7 billion off of opium, which they then doubled via Shanghai real estate investments. By the end of World War I, Sir Victor Sassoon was rising up through the family ranks, and in the 1920s becomes the new head of the family. And seeing Gandhi's revolution in India threatened the family business. He upended everything and reinvested the family fortune into Shanghai real estate during a boom period that rapidly surpassed the value of what the assets would be worth if left in India. The flagship of the whole operation, now the beautiful Art Deco Cathay Hotel, which opened in 1929 as the best spot in Shanghai, a wondrous monument described as an Art Deco rocket ship, but built on a foundation of vile drug money. And the most fitting part, right across the street, is an old monument unveiled by the British royalty of Sir Harry Parks himself, the man who lit the match igniting the Second Opium War, causing subsequent decades of drug-induced horrors, along with all the wealth it brought the Sassoons and the British. Centuries of history imbued into a statue brought to life here by the excellent character modeling talent of Hisu Che, who made the model for me here based off a very limited amount of historical photo sources. From an aesthetic perspective, because the Cathay is quite beautiful, the architecture is nothing but magnificent. Sir Victor had hired the notable British firm of Palmer and Turner, who'd designed so many of the buildings on the Bund that they could walk down the waterfront and say, here they are standing in a row, big ones, small ones, some the biggest in the city, and that is what Sir Victor desired. The Sassoon House would be the tallest building on the Bund. The architect, Tug Wilson, was no doubt inspired by New York City's Woolworth skyscraper, once the tallest in the world. Despite the Woolworth's Gothic stylings and the Sassoon House and its dapper Art Deco dress, the buildings follow similar massing schemes and programs. Prominent towers set back from the building mass, with floor plans that feature interior arcades for multiple points of access, no matter what side of the lot a pedestrian arrives from. Both plans similarly provide interior storefronts for individual shops before converging at a central domed rotunda. For those traversing the Bund, this scheme couldn't be more fitting with such humid summers. The Cathay brought a level of needed life to the Bund, with most of the surrounding buildings being banks and offices, excluding, of course, the big clock tower, the old customs house here, where imports and exports were checked for duties. Among the merchant vessels arriving here stood Griffons, the colloquial term for new arrivals in Shanghai. The rule being, new arrivals start as Griffons and eventually, if they succeed in Shanghai, become Taipans, a Cantonese term technically pronounced Daban in Chinese, meaning big rank, aka top rank of a businessman. Being a Taipan in Shanghai meant you'd arrived and the city was yours. But until that happened, Griffons needed a place to stay, and that was often the tallest building, visible to a Griffon from the bow of a ship steaming up the Guangxu. Naturally, that would be the Cathay Hotel. Or it would be if not for the construction happening next door, a new proposed Art Deco tower, so monumental it would put Victor's to shame. he wouldn't stand for this. But the international settlement's bend towards satisfaction of Victor Sassoon's wishes did indeed find a limit, a check against his Taipan status. There was a new boss in town, Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Republic of China through the Kuomintang, Kuomintang in Chinese. They were the new ruling party of China, and this new building going up would be the primary governmental financial center in Shanghai, the Bank of China. Why were the Kuomintang in power? Well, we have a bit of history to fill in between the Second Opium War and the 30s. The Opium Wars had been detrimental to the Qing Dynasty, concessions to the foreigners that of course didn't end with just the wars. The concessions never end. And the Qing Empire spent the latter half of the 19th century bleeding territory to the usual suspects on top of now Russia, Germany, and even the growing Japanese Empire, who they lost serious territory to after the First Sino-Japanese War. Economics? What economics? Shanghai and Hong Kong, the epicenters of trade and commerce, were in the hands of the foreigners. Then, at the Peking, now Beijing capital, middle of 1898, the Guangxu emperor, presiding over his court within the Forbidden City, decides to change course and steer the country away from what might be certain doom. He was influenced by great progressive thinkers and began to establish positive and sweeping reforms that could have fixed structural problems that were at the root of imperial rot. Unfortunately, the reforms couldn't be put to the test, as they were unceremoniously dismantled, rapidly, by the Empress Dowager, his aunt, though functionally more like a mother figure, which may seem odd to have the emperor play second fiddle to the Empress Dowager, but the systems of Confucius philosophy place the elders of an emperor above the emperor himself in the hierarchy of power, especially when Peking courtiers, afraid of losing their own power and reform policies, become willing to back the court elder over a possibility of progressive change. A Brit, Sir Reginald Johnston, tutor to the subsequent emperor years later, had a rare outsider seat within the Forbidden City, many of the specifics of which he shares in his writings. In short, his accounts explain the emperor's imprisonment at the behest of his aunt. Heaven's connection to earth, now a toy for the Empress Dowager's callous entertainment. Throwing the emperor's favorite consort down a well while holding the title Venerable Buddha, self-proclaiming as a bodhisattva reincarnation, and almost as if the Buddha himself intervened, her cosmic enlightenment would be tested in 1899. She was dealt a rather inevitable hand. A rebellion was growing across China, a wildfire of mob justice, acts of violence against foreigners and Christian missionaries, the devils who were blamed for every wrong against China. The foreign concessions, opium, sure, absolutely justified outrage. But the scale of the enemy blew past any level of rationality, an unfortunate side effect when many of their grievances may have been just, which meant, in their fervor, that the droughts and famines hitting China at the time proved that the land must have been hexed by those Christians and their dark magic. And this uprising, the Boxer Rebellion, had some members who believed that they themselves had ancient and just magics on their side as well, including an invulnerability to bullets. And frankly, they were, at least against Imperial guns. The Empress Dowager herself had her own qualms against the foreign devils, also both justified and imagined, so instead of putting down the rebellion, she gave them Peking's blessing, and against all levels of rationality, declared war against the foreign nations. All of them. The Boxers found invincibility by royal favor, but mob justice can never be controlled nor contained. The violence grew out of control, and the Qing Empire was fractured on how to deal with it. Some regions of China and imperial branches saw the lunacy of such a declaration of wide-scale war, with no allies to speak of, while others followed the Empress Dowager's command. The foreign powers, with all their investments in Shanghai and the East, felt they had to intervene and put down the rebellion. An alliance of countries across America and Europe laid siege to Peking and put down the Boxers, who now found their invulnerability to bullets put to the real test. But even the most devoted Western proponent would soon find the thought that these foreign armies are here for salvation to be a thought fast fleeting, as the invading armies answered the Boxers' massacres with their own violence and looting. And of course, the armies were not discriminatory about who was on the receiving end of their brutal pillaging. Innocent civilians were often treated likewise with fighting Boxers. After the rebellion was quelled, at the cost of another consequential foreign invasion of Peking, soldiers, of course, properly satisfied with their loot, the Forbidden City was returned to the Empress Dowager, after she'd had to hold her nose and kowtow to the foreigners. But the empire's days were numbered. Sir Johnston describes the tragedy rather sadly. The empire, in their own incompetence, had been too weak to stop exploitation at the hands of foreigners, and then gave face to a rebellion that only led to further doom. And the side of the tragedy that touched the average Chinese citizen was that under the Qing's willful ignorance, before all these foreign wars, they enjoyed rather pleasant freedoms. Not to say the imperial edicts intentionally mandated such outcomes, though perhaps the ancient sages understood a more holistic truth behind the mandate of heaven. Either way, the empire still demanded fealty, taxes, the Q haircut, of course, but imperial involvement in a citizen's life wasn't necessarily always felt, which was also part of the problem. Anyone with an incompetent boss knows this game. Times are easy and stress is low, but when a crisis hits, suffering is magnified. Plus, your organization is at threat from outsiders. That was the Qing Empire at the end of the 19th century. Other countries were eating their lunch nationally, while the average person retained freedoms through a lack of government oversight. But this would have to change for the country to survive in this new, rapidly changing world. Freedom sacrificed for standing on the world stage as a nation. And indeed, the winds of change were gusting. Missionaries and intellectuals had been spreading Western thought far and wide, first out of Shanghai and Hong Kong, then all over China. And there was a growing local progressive movement to democratize the country. One such progressive, a Dr. Sun Yat-sen, had been baptized and traveled to Hawaii for an American education, whereupon it became apparent what the Americans had done to their royal liege. Dr. Sun had a rather good gambit too. He realized that the Qing Empire wasn't exactly tyrannical to the average countryman, which is usually why regimes end. So he frames the imperial question in a way that resonated greatly. See, China is overwhelmingly of Han Chinese descent, but the Qing dynasty were Manchus who conquered China centuries prior. They remained quite a small part of the population, despite controlling all levers of real imperial power, leaving the Han Chinese with no representation despite being the largest population in the country. Dr. Sun was uniquely positioned to raise funds across the world and guide a wave of Chinese revolutionaries to victory in a new path of Chinese history. In 1911, the revolutionaries staged their rebellion, and at great sacrifice, they succeed. And by 1912, off the throne comes a young boy of 6 who was made emperor at age 3 in 1908 when the imprisoned Guangxu emperor died, followed almost immediately by the death of the Empress Dowager. Puyi, the last emperor, had merely reigned for a couple years, albeit after being deposed, remained in the Forbidden City, titles intact due to a complicated abdication agreement. So it was from there that he and his British mentor, Sir Johnston, saw Sun Yat-sen ascend to power as the first provisional president of the new Republic of China, with the KMT as his political party. But despite his American tendencies and incredible achievement, Dr. Sun wasn't George Washington. Sir Johnston clocked Dr. Sun as a great revolutionary, a man of initiative who cared about the fate of the country, but he lacked the talent for politicking in the viper's nest that is post-revolution. The new republic had made a deal with the Qing general, Yuan Shikai. His army would turn on the empire, and the Qing would therefore have to abdicate. But the trade-off would be Dr. Sun steps aside for Yuan Shikai to lead. A deal that the new republic would soon come to regret, as Yuan Shikai wasn't satisfied as president and declared himself as emperor. His so-called reign didn't last long, but in the aftermath, the warlord period began. Decades of more bloodshed across China, with Dr. Sun and the KMT fighting to keep the dream of the Republic alive. Puyi, the once emperor, remained locked away within the Forbidden City, as Sir Johnston carried on his duty to guide and teach the boy. Perhaps one day he might yet lead. A day that wouldn't come, at least not in the way Johnston would hope. And outside the Forbidden City, the absent government and relative safety the Chinese populace once enjoyed now eroded from the turmoils inflicted by the warlords and their rival armies. Somewhere in there was the Republic trying to stabilize the situation. Leaving the question, after all the sacrifices made by the revolutionaries, would the new nation be able to pull through? In Shanghai, it was still business as usual. The presence of British gunboats makes it rather easy to remain insulated from warfare happening further inland. Really, this meant the Taipans went on making their fortunes, while the conditions remained horrific for pretty much everyone else. Starvation was rampant in Shanghai. It wasn't uncommon to find dead bodies on the street, or even abandoned babies. Taipans and bankers ignored the horrors, simply walking past on their way to work along the Bund, or more likely from the comfort of rickshaws, a sort of taxi cart pulled by destitute workers who were referred to as coolies. All these conditions only turned more people to the big smoke, as opium was often the only release from the pain of life in the city. Indeed, the journalist John Powell described the conditions of the streets in the book Shanghai's Saga as follows. Like beggars the world over, Shanghai's mendicants knew all the tricks of extracting money from pedestrians. There were those who picked up the corpses of abandoned girl babies off the vacant lots each morning, slung them across their bare chests, and used them as decoys for the soft-hearted. They changed them only when the presence of the dead little innocents began to offend the nose. The streets obliterated the souls of many, though some residents of Shanghai did ascend the hierarchical social divisions. A new class of rich Chinese, called compradors, grew their wealth by working alongside the Taipans, often as intermediaries between Chinese and foreigners in trade and banking. By the 20s, what you end up with is at the top, the rich Taipans, a wealthy comprador Chinese class, Griffons and middle-class foreigners, then a considerably large number of poor factory workers, coolies, and dock workers. Nevertheless, it's not surprising that this level of poverty and class division was the environment that led to the founding of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. The meeting itself, held in a Shanghai row house called a shikumen, sort of a blend between East and West architecture, a common architectural topology out near the French Concession. And it was there that a young Mao Zedong was present for the very beginning of a journey that would decades in the future once again changed the course of China. And by the late 1920s, future leader Deng Xiaoping would also spend many of his early years in Shanghai working for the Communist Party. But for now, it was a young but growing movement, spurred greatly by Shanghai's hostile treatment of the working class and the West's willful ignorance of such suffering. Even Dr. Sun found himself impartial to the CCP and brought them into a sort of allied partnership with the KMT, as a means of building a coalition that could finally defeat the warlords and unite China. But this partnership wouldn't last for long, as Dr. Sun's health took a turn in 1925, and he unfortunately died, leaving an environment that gave rise to an up-and-coming political player, and an event that would upend Shanghai's balance of power. KMT military commander Chiang Kai-shek pulls a coup d'etat in 1926 and began a military campaign to take China under the control of a single nationalist party, with himself as the head of state. And under his leadership, the unification would become successful. Warlords under control, and the Republic of China was finally seen as a legitimate regional power and a rival to their neighbors. Chiang Kai-shek was seen as formidable, someone to take seriously, an important sign to project when in the 20s and 30s, the neighboring Japanese empire was growing ambitious. But this new leader of the KMT also broke Dr. Sun's communist alliance and expelled CCP leaders from government. Even the Reds in Moscow betrayed their comrades when Stalin aligned himself with Chiang Kai-shek, which frankly shouldn't surprise anyone, as questionable treaties with nationalistic leaders was of course Stalin's specialty. Now, suddenly ally-less and the walls closing in, the communist revolutionaries could have given up, but continued to fight on against the nationalists in cities across China. Soon, the conflict found Shanghai, one of the most important cities to control, with the glint of riches held in the banks and all those lucrative imports. Fumbling the control of Shanghai would be detrimental, and the nationalists' prior victories against the communists could hardly be considered decisive. So, it was in April 1927 that Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek was right outside Shanghai and had a dastardly plan to beat the thousands of communists and their sympathizers inside the city, who by this point were now armed after raiding police stations. The foreign settlement held its breath, fearful of brutal combat in the streets, and if not warfare, then it'd be revolting workers disrupting the flow of commerce. But Chiang Kai-shek's plan was set into motion. Out of left field, he enters into a pact with the boss of the Green Gang, the so-called Green Dragon, Old Snake Eyes as described by local reporters, Yat-sen, the most powerful gangster in Shanghai and likely all of China. The Generalissimo and the Dragon Boss became blood brothers, as gangsters throughout the city began hunting down and massacring thousands of communists, of those captured, beheaded in public executions. The aftermath was bloody, but according to the foreign residents of Shanghai, full-scale destruction was at least avoided, and women and children likely saved from collateral damage, which was an unfortunate reality of warfare that had occurred in other cities across China. So, in recounts of the damage done, Yat-sen was hailed as a sort of hero in the eyes of the foreign press, but, as the ancient Troy foretold, no return to ignorance can save the city from the consecution of what was to come. For the communists, the thousands killed became martyrs, and it was obvious that any chance of working with the KMT was burned. A now overlooked book of historical fiction that dramatizes the massacre is this 1933 novel, Man's Fate by André Malraux, a perspective which is of French origin based around their concession as the primary setting. The plot follows a fictionalized assassination attempt against Chiang Kai-shek. Despite the book's what-if nature, it accurately depicts the signs of the time and was, for much of the world, their first exposure to the Chinese political struggle that would carry on even after World War II. You get this perspective of the communist revolutionaries almost like that of a Hollywood war epic, men willing to die heroically for what they believe. The main characters debate passionately about the morality of what assassination of the KMT leader means, and why they believed it could be justified after the slaughter of so many workers at the hands of Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek. The Reds in Moscow were gone, no longer interested in supporting their dying comrades. Hope was lost. But the characters of the book found that individual determination, the option for a man to choose his own fate, is the reason to carry on in the face of Shanghai's despair. And if violence was going to be the path, it's at least a choice that masters fate. Though the perspective of the SMC foreign leadership, quite different. They were rather impressed with the whole affair, given that business remained relatively uninterrupted, and they found the new KMT to be reasonable partners in the governance of Shanghai. It wasn't even that insulting when Yat-sen and his gang was given control of the opium trade in Shanghai. Effectively, a free ride to conduct any level of illegal business they wanted. Especially given that the French concession police, corrupt beyond all help, had years prior already installed the Green Dragon as an honorary detective, which basically meant that cops and the Green Gang managed this sort of illusion of policing, or at least it would have been an illusion had not pretty much everyone known what was happening. But hey, if colonial life meant you were well on your way to making it as a taipan, and the tourists could still hit the Charleston every night over at the cafe, who cares if enforcement of crime was ridiculously lopsided? John Powell describes the Green Dragon hanging out at the old Shanghai nightclubs as follows. The carpet was laid down especially for the big fellow, Yat-sen. As a dancer, the underworld boss was about as graceful as a mythical green dragon whom he represented. Yet, he stepped out regularly and always appeared to be having the time of his life. But for the extraordinary precautions taken to protect One would never have suspected this man of heading a villainous organization, the very name of which put fear into the hearts of hundreds of millions from Shanghai to Singapore. The extraordinary precautions, referencing the many bodyguards he'd bring with him to the clubs. But his entourage wasn't only guards. John Powell further describes, in Shanghai, the most popular girls could look big Hollywood stars in the eye from the same income bracket. The wealthy Chinese fans saw to that. Men like Yat-sen, for instance. When took to terpsichore, he made his favorite sing-song girls learn Western-style dancing too. He took them around the town, 2, 3, and 4 at a time, all decked out in mink and diamonds. And old Snake Eyes sure had an eye for beauty. He just loved listening to the gasps of surprise and admiration the crowd threw his way every time he went abroad among Shanghai's bright lights. Indeed, the city was carrying on, and by the 30s it was fairly stable, backed by a corrupt government, gangsters, and colonial businesses. But what about the money in this whole picture? Well, earlier that century, as Dr. Sun's government was taking off, he fell in love with a woman, Sung Qingling, herself from a prominent family that had grown rich in Shanghai. Her father had been converted to Christianity and had paid the westernization forward by sending his kids to America to study. Notably, Qingling had 2 sisters, the older Ailing and younger Meiling, all 3 the famous Sassoon sisters. Qingling, the middle, married to the father of China himself. Ailing had married the richest banker in China, H.H. Kong. And Meiling, well, more about her in a moment. But the network effect of this family would have far-reaching impacts on China and the country's pocketbook. H.H. Kong developed much of the KMT's financial framework and secured funding for the new government. Since the 19th century, the foreign settlement managed most deals with the Mexican silver dollar. It was universally accepted pretty much everywhere in the world at the time, therefore a rational currency to trade, albeit inconvenient to be lugging around silver coins. But no worry, the Bund's banks had a solution. Issuing personal lines of credit became quite popular. A new Griffin arriving in Shanghai only need open an account at one of the banks along the river. With their bank of choice, almost everything in the city could be bought on credit. Upon checkout, customers are presented with a chit, a piece of paper showing an amount credited, and the customer need only sign. At the end of the day, trusted chit coolies collect the paper receipts and cart them to the banks along the Bund for processing. Of course, you can imagine the temptation to write hundreds of chits, then skip town, and thus some level of trust needed to be attained with the banks before one could be part of the chit system, which made such an achievement part of a young Griffin's journey towards becoming a Taipan. Local Chinese had a similar system that went back much further, but instead of chits, they used chops, small trinkets, often jade, with a stamp on the bottom to mark a signature. The key to signifying the authenticity was chopping off a small chunk at the stamp's corner to make a personalized permanent mark, which all may seem rather complex for the dealings of local business, but take a step up and macro finances make these physical systems seem quaint. With Chiang Kai-shek's rise to power, payments got a bit more complicated. All those banks along the Bund had been dealing with the silver dollar for a good while, and then the United States had to go and throw a wrench into the whole global economy, no surprise there, by getting cheeky with the gold standard. Americans could no longer exchange gold for dollars freely, and both gold, and silver to a lesser extent, became nationalized commodities, not something that should seem to affect China. But in 1934, the US started mass buying silver. All those dollars in Shanghai became more valuable as exports sent out to the States, leaving Shanghai with a constricted money supply. Even more destabilizing, given that gold across the world also found its way into the US stockpiles by way of prices too good to pass up. Whole thing was a mess. The US set exchange rates to devalue the dollar's buying power in reference to the requisitioned gold. Then, when the metals were in, so came the fix, and the dollar to gold exchange rate suddenly got more favorable. FDR made the gold play to secure the government's Depression-era monetary policy. But while his great gold gravy train steamed on, the congressional silver lobby could only watch from the platform, feeling left out without a ticket to ride. FDR still needed the political goodwill of these silverites to secure support for more New Deal policies that would follow up on the National Recovery Administration programs. So, policy was passed to get the silver rights on board too, and that's how you get the Silver Purchase Act of 1934, along with the unintended consequence of China losing all those Mexican dollars. This pretty much wrecked interest rates and reduced the value of the nationalist government's economic holdings. Extraterritoriality wasn't just for foreign citizens, as the Bund's banks shared the privilege too. And after what the Americans just pulled, the banks raised borrowing rates. Not a pleasant situation for Chiang Kai-shek, who couldn't run a country with such unfavorable conditions in which to sell bonds, much less fight the warlords or the communists. So in 1935, the Generalissimo learns from the US on how to shore up a crumbling economy, and he consolidates power over banking in Shanghai. Not a full nationalization of the banking sector, but rather he installed loyal KMT servants at major Chinese banks. And the big ones, like the Bank of China, would begin issuing a fiat currency via a mandatory exchange of silver. Metals swapped for funny money printed with the portrait of the national father. Oh, and the exchange rates here, just like with the Americans' method, favored the government. And also like in America, Shanghai got a short-term influx of stimulus pumped into the economy. Of course, the stimmy-up ride is never without consequences, and inflation would later become the KMT's own noose. But for now, the 30s was party time. Within the KMT government, it was the husband of Eiling, the big banker H.H. Kong, who oversaw much of this as finance minister of China, but he had help in implementation and design of this plan from another member of the Sung family, a Sung brother, Tu Sung, governor of the Central Bank of China. Oh, and of course, they found a way to include old Snake Eyes in all of this, as Yat-sen was also installed on the Financial Banking Committee in Shanghai. And all three of them enjoyed unparalleled transfers of wealth into their respective families, as not every reclaimed silver dollar found itself in the government's coffers. All these schemes needed cooperation with the big foreign banks, and to attain equal standing, they would begin construction on a new tower right next to the Cathay, the Bank of China building, a massive structure that would dwarf Sir Victor's masterpiece. Even the architectural design wasn't to be carried out in its entirety by Palmer and Turner, like almost everything else in the Bund, but a Chinese architect of considerable skill, a Lu Qianshou, was the principal designer, and his drawings for the new Art Deco tower were something to behold, masterfully blending modern Art Deco with Chinese ornamentation. Needless to say, Sir Victor was not happy about any of this, especially after buying quite a sum in government bonds. I mean, how's a poor millionaire to influence the government these days when bribes can't even ensure that your masterpiece skyscraper isn't little brothered by its next door neighbor? Fortunately, for Sir Victor, the SMC Council intervened and imposed a height limit on the Bank of China, gimping its height down to 1 story less than the Sassoon house. But for the tower, merely a minor setback, as when it was eventually completed after World War II, it ended up quite the looker, one of my favorites in its architectural design, and it complements the Cathay quite nicely. Now, there's a question in how Chiang Kai-shek wrangled this financial web together, and that takes us to the other next-door neighbor of the Cathay, the Palace Hotel, the venue to Shanghai's most notable engagement party. The happy couple, the Generalissimo himself, and the youngest Soon sister, Sung Mei-ling, otherwise known as Madame Chiang. Indeed, as the leader of the KMT, Chiang Kai-shek married into the Sung family, ensuring absolute dominion over all aspects of government. And Sung Mei-ling would end up being quite a powerful woman in her own right during World War II, leading significant efforts against Japanese invaders. So then, if the Palace Hotel is so important, why is it missing in my scene here? The reason has more to do with the architecture than the history. Frankly, the building was poorly realized. In the original 1904 drawings, we see a handsome Queen Anne Victorian, and for those familiar with my past work, I am indeed quite fond of the Queen Anne mode. But in the detailed drawings and oversight during construction, the architects dropped the ball, leading to a rather bland building full of construction problems. Then, in 1912, the roof tower burned down, and spire roofs, of course, are a major staple of Queen Anne design. By the 20s, Palmer and Turner had to intervene and redo much of the building. Tug Wilson himself stated, "The Palace Hotel was never a thing of beauty. It is to be hoped that it will soon give way to something better." A century later, Mr. Wilson will get his wish, at least virtually, as I have leveled the lot and intend to construct something he'd be fond of. The vision is to develop an Art Deco tower that sits well next to the Cathay and the Bank of China. Given that Nanking Road is the major shopping corridor, the building will not be a hotel, but a department store and a tea house. As above all things, in the 30s, the Palace Hotel held the city's most popular tea room, right across from the Cathay at the intersection of the Bund and Nanking Road. The tea room featured large street-level windows, perfect spot from which to people watch. People watch sleepwalkers, that is. Shanghai landers sleepwalking the way into a looming doom. 1937 marks the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War, when the Japanese invade China. In 1941, the fall of Shanghai, when the Japanese simultaneously bomb Pearl Harbor. Old Shanghai was like a party gone on entirely too long, and the end always comes due. An old motto of the Shanghai landers after the Japanese invasion was, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die." It is from the vision of my Shanghainese wife that she imagines my department store I'm designing here could be themed to the story of the Peony Pavilion, a classic in Chinese poetry. For those familiar with the story, you know where this is going. And for everyone else, please stay tuned for subsequent sessions where I will be covering all aspects of the building design and more Shanghai history. Though before starting on the department store, there was a building missing. Next to the Palace Hotel was the North China Daily News Building, a classical structure designed by the firm of Lester, Johnson, and Morris. Before I get into the Peony department store, the following sessions will cover the history of this building and modeling it for the Unreal scene. As I believe that to do Art Deco well, it is important to first understand principles of classical design. And of course, before designing anything new, an approach that pays respect to the nearby site is required for any level of quality. So stay tuned for more. With each successive episode, where I lay the colossal stone blocks for the Daily News building, or draft architectural plans, then implement such plans for the Peony Pavilion, the clock also ticks closer to 1937, the year in which the city's fate befalls doom, then reincarnation. But when the pavilion opens its doors, it might already be too late for the sleepwalking Shanghai landers of the 1930s.